I wanted to make this video in response to the comments I read in the recent Vancouver Sun article regarding the Conservative candidate here on Vancouver Island, Marina Shapurshnikoff's comments regarding Indigenous people. The story broke from a journalism student who spent time with Shapurshnikoff on election night, and when the student had mentioned that they were taking Indigenous studies, Marina had some comments regarding Indigenous studies and Indigenous people. In particular, one of her comments that she had made said Indigenous people didn't have any sophisticated laws. They were savages and they fought each other all the time. These are racist statements. Again, I do want to note that Shapurshnikoff is from a different culture, and we should be offering some grace to people for not fully understanding other cultures, as we may not fully understand her culture. But at the same time, the term savage is a racial slur. The term savage was used to explain that Indigenous people weren't even human. I consider the word savage similar to the N-word for Black people, also used as a word to explain that you aren't even human. This may sound pretty harsh, but even when you look at Canada's Indian Act from 1700s, an Indian was considered not a person, and an Indian could only be a man. It wasn't until 10 years later that an Indigenous woman could then be considered an Indian, and an Indian again wasn't a person. So using the word savage is explaining that Indigenous people aren't actually people at all and were not people. And there were sophisticated laws and structures and governance that just were not understood by colonial culture and by people coming in. And when a lot of those laws were recorded in Eastern Canada through a wampum belt and art in the British Columbia and Vancouver Island, where I am, those laws are recorded through arts and carvings. So just because something isn't written down in a specific book does not mean that it isn't a law, and does not mean that it is not sophisticated. Also noting that when the Vancouver Sun did reach out to Shapurshnikoff, she did recant her statement saying not 100% savages, maybe 90% savages, but still all Indigenous people are people. They have always been people. And I feel that this isn't necessarily a situation where I want to get political in saying, oh, John Rustad should kick this person out of the party. And I know we have all sorts of other parties coming forward and using this opportunity to talk about kicking someone out of the party. And that's just not where I'm at. I'm not saying she shouldn't. I'm just saying that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to use this as an opportunity to talk about cultural intelligence and understanding these components. Shapurshnikoff had also mentioned to the student that Indigenous people didn't even have an alphabet, trying to explain how they were savages and unsophisticated. And it's true. Most Indigenous communities did not have a written culture, and their language and stories were passed down orally. And even now, when we look in modern day times, that folks are looking for things that are documented in old books, written in words, and that is deemed more truthful, and it's deemed as here's history. But if things aren't recorded in a written old book with yellow pages, that somehow they don't exist, and that is not true at all. The student, when speaking with Shapurshnikoff, had mentioned they were taking Indigenous studies, and at that point, Shapurshnikoff was talking about how people are trying to rewrite Indigenous history and coming across with an agenda and trying to say that these new ways of talking about Indigenous history and culture are trying to rewrite a history. And in that, I find that one to be really, really troubling. And as I mentioned before, for so long, things that are written down in books, in languages like French or English, are deemed as truth, where Indigenous ways of recording history and thoughts were different. And because they were different and done in different ways that other people may not understand, then they were just deemed to not exist. And even right now, when we're relearning Indigenous history, and I have taught Indigenous history in post-secondary institutions, one thing that I've noticed is we are learning a bit more truths and a bit more of what really happened, but Indigenous people are still being painted as victims, where yes, they were victimized and victims, but there is so much strength and resilience that comes across through Indigenous history that still isn't being taught. One story, for example, that I read in a book called "The Northwest is Our Mother: The History of Métis People," it had talked about when Métis families were first beginning, and settlers had come over and met an Indigenous woman and made them their wife and started a family. When the men had to relocate on boats, their Indigenous wives and children were not welcome to come with them. And these Indigenous mothers would put their children, supplies, and food in a canoe, and they would paddle and breastfeed to meet their husband where his ship had landed. That is strength. That is resilience. I'm an Indigenous single mom, and when I read that, it just made me so proud to see the strength of those mothers. And those are stories that we're missing. Often when we're talking about Indigenous women, we aren't hearing about that strength and that resilience that our ancestors had and that we still carry from our ancestors. Also, wanting to note that Saperzhnikov had mentioned when they were a family doctor that Indigenous people weren't answering questions and they wouldn't speak up and they wouldn't talk, and saying how most Indigenous people, I think her quote here was 90% of Indigenous people use drugs, where there's nothing sorted for that or cited for that. And in there saying, I ask questions and people don't want to communicate. In there, we're looking at, for someone looking at Indigenous people, saying you didn't have a sophisticated language, you come from savages. Whether or not she said that to the people, which I highly doubt ever would have come out of her mouth, is that people come out of her mouth in an instance in a doctor's office to a patient, is when people don't feel comfortable, they don't feel validated, and they don't feel like someone is there to really meet them on the same place as you're a person and I'm a person and we deserve that same respect. Of course, people aren't necessarily going to want to speak up. And in that, it's not about I asked the question and someone didn't answer. It's looking at what is this person's cultural background and what is the best way that I can reach them. And this isn't just how we can communicate with Indigenous people. This is how we should be communicating with everybody. For so long in our society, we have been dictated that we need to communicate and walk through life following one standard. And that one standard, what it is doing, it is perpetuating a certain demographic of people to continuously move forward in life, and people who understand unwritten rules and nuances in life that benefit them, where other people who do not have that are being left behind. So for me, this is why these questions are so these comments that are made are so dangerous. And saying that trying to teach Indigenous history is and the use of UNDRIP is creating and other British Columbians to be second-class citizens is absolutely absurd. And I think in that, I can understand maybe where someone's brain comes to say that. But in acknowledging that, to me, it's hearing that trying to create equality for Indigenous people in British Columbia is somehow taking things away from other people. And I don't believe that that is the case. It's trying to look at a situation where you've had Indigenous people who have lived here for generations and generations and thousands of years, and the first keepers of this land, to be mistreated and abused and traumatized by society. And then trying to right that wrong is now taking things away from everybody else. At the end of the day, we are all people, and we all deserve the same respect, care, and compassion as everybody else. And in that, I do acknowledge Saperzhnikov is Russian, and I'm certain there's many racist comments floating around because of this story, the fact that Saperzhnikov is Russian. And in that way, too, that is also racist. So this has nothing to do with pointing a finger at someone being Russian or whatever race or culture people carry. It's how can we meet people where they're at, and how can we start treating all people with the same respect for just being people. So in here, to me, the most troubling points of view is perpetuating these stereotypes and actively speaking, saying Indigenous people are savages, they're unsophisticated, they're all on drugs, and they didn't even have an alphabet. To taking that moment to say these are viewpoints from someone who hasn't taken that time to educate themselves, and instead of maybe looking at our political leaders and trying to use this as an opportunity to cancel people, let's take that as an opportunity to say we have people in this country that are still believing these things and trying to pass them off as truth. And how can we look at our own society and how can we start to shift that narrative and build that cultural intelligence where people can be treated with equality? And sometimes we don't have to necessarily understand things in order to respect them. And so looking at when, oh, they didn't have any sophisticated laws. Actually, Indigenous people had many sophisticated laws. And you could look at a wampum belt, and that wampum belt has been woven, and it has all of that information in those laws. I am Indigenous. I have ancestors whose cultures were making wampum belts. I personally do not know how to read a wampum belt, but because I can't read that wampum belt doesn't make it any less sophisticated, meaningful, or truth. So if you want to get political with this, feel free, like do whatever you want with that. But for me, this opportunity is a really good opportunity to start highlighting the importance of cultural intelligence and making sure that before we can come to conclusions or statements that we're then passing off as truth in public forums, that maybe we can take a moment to step back and do some learning ourselves.